after the 2010 election, a political reporter in Denver with the Fox affiliate told me that his television reporting was actually getting in the way of his real reporting on Twitter. He breaks more stories on Twitter throughout the day than he can on the evening news. Tim Sweeney said yesterday in his opening remarks that we can shape the debates of our time, but as we all know, how we go about doing that is changing rapidly, and we have to adapt. In this panel, we have 4 leaders who will help us understand the new communications landscape, and they'll particularly help us see some of the gaps in capacities and the opportunities for our movement. So we'll get right to it. Please welcome Tara McGuinness, David Brock, Monica Trasandes, and Thomas Wheatley. First, we're going to hear from Tara. Tara is the Senior Vice President for Communications at the Center for American Progress. And Tara is going to take a little time to kind of give us the lay of the land of this new communications landscape. And she's going to share CAP's Fight Club rules for communicating in it.
Need a communications expert to tell you that the landscape is changing. When you think about the old media landscape, it was very straightforward for decades. There were new folks on the horizon, but in general, it was a peaceful scene with big players. The threshold to engagement, whether it was fireside chats and radio or the use of TV and campaigns in the 60s, the threshold was very clear. The barriers were high to get in, but it was straightforward. The media is changing all around us, and some of these old players, although they're not going away, are new in the way that things are happening. For example, a new study shows that since 2000, the number of people who said they read a daily paper has declined basically by half. When you think about television, evening news viewership since 1980 has declined by half. Although morning television is increasing, if you look at this, this chart's very telling. This is a downward spiral for television. Doesn't mean that television's going away. We heard yesterday in the marriage panel, this is the #1 way that people heard about various initiatives. But it means that in terms of trusted messengers, the horizon is changing. So I want to talk a little bit about a theory, my own personal theory of this new media landscape. It's based on my experience working as kind of a communicator organizer over the past decade. This new media landscape has the same old players, but it has some new players. It has some old players engaging in new ways. So where you used to have radio, anyone can set up their own podcast and broadcast. And in some cases, this has lowered the threshold for entry, but it's getting very noisy. You had the local news reporter who still has to do their news reporting job, but is ducking in between events to tweet and break news. Television is interacting with these new media. And then you have all forms of new social media, from Google to YouTube to Twitter. There's Facebook. There's like a ton of ways that people are receiving information. Just to give you like a little snapshot of this, Facebook is its own nation now with over 1 billion users. In a moment of intensity and interaction, the highest, most tweeted event in history was 10.3 million tweets during the presidential debate in a little over an hour. But I want to be clear that these new things are not replacing the old things. They're adding to the way things work. In fact, 55% of New York Times readers, we could do a survey in here, are now reading the New York Times on their devices. So since Kate's left, I want to keep up the obsession with the Pope here for a moment. In 2005, right now we're waiting for the white smoke to see, Tim Sweeney's replacement. But in 2005, this is people watching for the white smoke. In 2013, the same scene looked like this. I think it's this snapshot, this visual image, tells us about how things are changing. And for those of us who want to break through and change the world, this changing landscape needs to change the calculus of what we invest in and how we break through. So what used to be a peaceful scenery is now turning into a complicated horizon. And I do want to be clear that this isn't the end of news. More people are reading more news all of the time. They have new sources. They're just not reading the same things. And this means that the nexus of the news horizon and the friendship horizon are meeting each other. We heard yesterday that it was although television was how people heard about a ballot initiative, who they trusted, or a measure, who they trusted to make their decision was their friend network. So The new media landscape I like to think of as a jungle. You know, it's not what the old media landscape was. The threshold used to be high. Now the question is, how do you break through in the jungle? So I have a few of my own tips. And I think understanding the space of the jungle, the actions, some of them are similar. The jungle is content hungry. If you have an interesting video of Newt Gingrich being covered by glitter, this will spread like wildfire. This is good TV. The jungle, like the old news media environment, is conflict-driven. And the jungle is highly interactive. This is not a one-thing solution. You can't run your campaign just on Twitter. It's how the Twitter meets the TV. So, Jon Stewart refers to the news now as being, does a lot of making fun of CNN for no longer being the TV anchors. He calls them the TV VJs, saying that there's sections of cable news where you literally just run YouTube clips. So how do you break through in this new environment? The tips that I would give to anyone trying to navigate this complicated environment are similar to what we've heard over the past couple days. You know, the news is still the news, whether it's on Facebook or a cave painting. You won't believe what happened to me. I have this incredible story to tell you, has been the way that people have communicated with each other for hundreds of years. In the same thing, whether it was in black and white or whether it's through Facebook, universal values resonate. They're more interesting. They're what change this world from a statistic or a report into something that matters to me. And I think a fundamental understanding of this new horizon and the way conflict is engaged in it helps us create better campaigns. So when I train communicators and work with groups, we do our Fight Club training. And so I'm going to bring you into a little bit of the Fight Club training that we give and get at Think Progress. Think Progress and the Center for American Progress are dedicated as a movement partner to helping break through with our ideas and our values. We have two component parts to that. We have, in this content-hungry environment, created our own newsroom. We have a blog that addresses all sorts of issues. We have our own LGBT blog. And if you're familiar with the comments of Reverend Gill, you may be familiar with the work of Think Progress. We break news about what's happening in the progressive sphere. We get over 40 million unique viewers on an annual basis. We also have a team that works alongside the newsroom to help move things through the progressive networks and break through in a cultural space. That team is our war room team, and we help to kind of take the news and organize it. So when we're doing trainings for groups, I frequently tell this story about my family. These are a few of my dad's siblings. My dad's the chubby one in the middle. They grew up in the Bronx. And around Thanksgiving, traditionally we tell this story about my dad and the other kids being on the playground in DeVoe Park in the Bronx. And Betty, who's the oldest sibling with the ringlets, came over and she saw Aunt Pat, the smaller one, crying one day in the park. She said, "What's going on, Pat?" And Pat said, "This bully has been picking on me, and he's picking on everyone. He steals people's lunch money. And I don't know what to do about it." And Aunt Betty said, "Well, point him out to me." So Aunt Pat points out the bully who's been wreaking havoc in DeVoe Park for months. Bigger kid picking on the smaller kids. And Betty walks over to the bully, steps up on her tippy toes, pulls his glasses off of his face, throws them onto the concrete, it's the Bronx, smashes on them, punches him in the nose, walks away, and fundamentally changes the rules of the playground forever. And I tell this story when I train people because I think it's important. I'm not suggesting that all politics are like sandbox politics, although in moments, as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., feels this way. That in this story, this is how lines are drawn in the sand. This is how you determine that you can't, strong people can't pick on the weak people. And that when someone stands up, the dynamic changes. So one small footnote on this story, if for chance you recognize this ringleted 8-year-old, she is my political mentor, my Aunt Betty, and a longtime activist in New York City for LGBT causes, including working at GMHC and being a long organizer of dances and pride parades. It's not particularly surprising after her early start in DeVoe Park. So I want to talk about the Fight Club rules, and then we'll see this animated in other people's work. We call these the Fight Club rules. They're basically how to break through. you know, there are going to be fights, and fights, especially for the news media, are where definitional work happens. We've talked about the long organizing efforts and communications work that goes into fights, but really there are pivotal moments. Does someone come out in sports? Does someone, you know, how did the vote go? It is through conflict that you demonstrate where you stand and what in our country is okay and what is not okay. And so I think sometimes we can be a little conflict averse as progressives, but it is in these moments where people understand what you're fighting for. Also, this is the way the media works. You know, when was the last time you read about a bill that everyone agreed on? Now, in fairness, there are not that many of those these days. But if you do, you don't have a story about that. And so by knowing that it's the points of conflict where you're demonstrating your side, you have a strategic advantage in how you break through. And finally, I just want to end here. There are fights. There have been fights on our issues. There is really a question of who picks the fights. Are they fights that we have deliberately set up by design, or are we pulled into someone else's arguments? And I think as we work across issue, this is a big piece of understanding, that are we in the fights that we started and picked? So I will leave it there on the Fight Club rules, and I'm interested to hear more about how this works with everyone else's projects.
Next, we're going to hear from David Brock. David is the founder and president of Media Matters for America. He's also the chair of the board of the American Independent News Network. They do many things, of course, but David is going to emphasize their role in monitoring and countering our opponents as they work with the media to promote truly fair and balanced coverage.
Thanks. Thanks, Bobby, and thanks for the opportunity to be here this morning. So I get the fun job of the weekend of not necessarily having to talk about issues and our message, but to talk about the bad guys and how to deal with them. We founded Media Matters a few years ago on a pretty simple concept. Basically, the notion is that we are in an information war with our opponents, and that if we set up a system where we could debunk their misinformation, push back on the propaganda in real time in every news cycle, we could level the media playing field and we could prevail. We do a lot of this work through a website. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, you can find it at MediaMatters.org. If you have read Al Franken's book, Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, it's basically that book online every day without the humor. Because I don't find any of this funny. As those of you who know me, I did work in the conservative movement for about a dozen years, and so I know firsthand the opponents do lie, they do cheat, and they approach the public discourse with very little integrity. So basically our job every day is, we watch Fox so you don't have to. We have a team in Washington working in war room style of 80 folks. We're monitoring a cross-section of coverage of every issue that you all care about. We're not, someone had asked me if we are an LGBT organization. Not specifically. We sort of are because I run it, but we do have one discrete LGBT project, Equality Matters, where we monitor coverage of our issue. So someone asked me last night, what's been in your sights this week? So let me just give you a couple of examples. There was no time for them to make the video. I don't know if you all heard about a fellow named Dr. Ben Carson, who recently came on the radar screen because he gave a speech at the National Prayer Breakfast trashing the president and the healthcare initiative. He's an African-American neurosurgeon from Johns Hopkins University who suddenly became this sensation in the right wing after giving this speech, relentlessly promoted on Fox. The Wall Street Journal editorial page said he should run for president. And so the question for Media Matters was, who is this guy and what are we going to do about this? And so we did some background research on him. We didn't find anything incredibly interesting. We did find that he said at one point that he didn't believe in evolution, which was kind of strange given his academic background. But basically, our approach was, let's just lay in the weeds and follow this guy and monitor everything he says, and we'll see who he is. And so sure enough, last week on Sean Hannity's show, he was asked about same-sex marriage, and he compared it to pedophilia and bestiality on national television. And so there's now, yesterday he fell all over himself trying to apologize because there's a big uproar on the Johns Hopkins campus where you've got hundreds and hundreds of faculty members and students trying to get him censured and have him not be their commencement speaker this year. But my point here is that this was an outrageous comment, and if it had been a racist comment, everybody here would know about this. And so I think there's still room for us to sort of amp up some of our outrage about what folks are getting away with. Another small item, I don't know if you got here in time on Thursday to see the Chicago Tribune. There's this group called the Ruth Institute, which is kind of an arm of the National Organization for Marriage. And they put out this week a release, and we monitor all their communications, touting the fact that the Chicago Bears had donated some fabulous memorabilia to a raffle to support their cause at a coming conference. So we looked a little suspiciously at that. We called the Chicago Bears. In fact, they said they knew nothing about this. It ended up being some, sort of freelance wacko person who donated this stuff, and then they falsely claimed the Bears were endorsing their agenda. So we got the Bears to disassociate themselves from Ruth Institute and NOM. And that may seem like a small thing, but that's what this is about. Every single day, discrediting, marginalizing, and shaming these folks. I took a little bit of a look at our research over the last couple years in preparation for this, just to come up with a few patterns and trends that I thought folks who maybe don't spend as much time watching cable news as I do might want to be aware of. But these are kind of 4 sort of cutting-edge right-wing arguments that we're hearing. One, that this debate is about religious liberty, that it's not about equality, that gays are the bullies, not the victims, using transgender folks as scapegoats, and a renewed focus on youth and the idea that gays are coming after your kids. Of course, this is propagated through lots of right-wing media, particularly on Fox. On Fox recently, we've learned that the California Fair Education Act is sexual brainwashing, that our kids are being taught in schools that they can have more than one gender or no gender at all, and that the most effective way to reduce anti-LGBT bullying is to just stop kids from being gay. Seriously. So all of this can spill over, which is a problem, out of Fox into mainstream media in a process through which some of these false notions then become a kind of conventional wisdom. So our job is to sort of try to stop them and contain them at their root. There are some related problems with the mainstream media. The main one, as I see it, is this notion of what I call phony balance. That there are 2 sides to a question when there actually aren't. And we see this on a range of issues. In climate change, you see 99% of scientific consensus on the issue, 1% funded by the coal industry, and this is presented by the media giving both sides equal weight. On our issue, my view is on an issue of civil rights, there really is not another side to the story. There wasn't necessarily another side to the story on segregation or on voting rights or on women's rights. But in this media climate we're in, we do see this kind of desire to be fair and balanced. And the way that plays out is, as you saw in the video, you've got extremist views like those held by somebody like Tony Perkins. And they're all over television. You don't see Nazis on television, but you do see Tony Perkins. Anti-gay groups like NOM are repeatedly identified not as anti-gay, but as pro-traditional marriage. And then you see right-wing frames, and we did a little study of the Boy Scout story in Media Matters, and the question was the frame that this was about discrimination, or was it about pedophilia? And our finding was it wasn't just on Fox, but on CNN as well. that overwhelmingly the framework that was favored by those two cable networks was about pedophilia. So mainstream media, I mean, we've been doing this for a while. It is getting better. There is some good news as the culture changes. The media changes as well. The Washington Post ombudsman recently wrote a great column defending their pro-gay coverage against right-wing attack and said this is a fundamental issue of civil rights and this is why we cover the story the way we do. And when we see things like that, we really should support them. In the coming coverage of the court battles, we're seeing that the right wing is resurrecting some old frames, nothing really new, things we've all heard before, that we are politically powerful, we're affluent, we don't need protection, trying to wedge gays against blacks, and then the old chestnut about activist judges. So expect to see that playing out in the coming weeks. So what do we do about all this? I just want to focus for a couple more minutes on the power of research and of investigation, of researching our opponents, investigating them, and presenting those facts to the public. Because we've shown time and again that they cannot bear the scrutiny. They hate the scrutiny. They hate the light that we're shining on them. We sent somebody from Media Matters, for example, to infiltrate last year one of the NOM conferences and wrote an incredible expose on what actually went on there. And that, in combination with a lot of other work that we and other organizations are doing on NOM, when we look at the patterns, really is changing the way the media treats that organization. We picked up on a blog some information about the anti-gay donations made by Chick-fil-A. And so we did a lot more extensive research into that. The research and the investigation can often have even more of an impact when there's some action attached to it. And so in this case, really a spontaneous boycott grew up around the country of Chick-fil-A. They did end up dropping funding from some of the most egregious groups. They are still funding others. And that's an example where I think if we could pile on some more, we could probably have some more impact. I mentioned the Boy Scouts. Last summer, we did some extensive and really meticulous research on companies that have non-discrimination policies in place that were funding the Boy Scouts. We published that research. Zach Walls then took up a change.org petition, put enormous pressure on some of these companies. Intel, UPS dropped their support on that basis of the Boy Scouts and started to bring this issue really to a head. And then finally, I imagine folks are familiar with this rigorous study out of the University of Texas, funded by the Witherspoon Institute. We filed FOIA requests in Texas to really figure out what was behind this study that is frequently cited by Republicans on the Hill in briefs to the courts, alleging that the children of heterosexual parents are better adjusted than those of same-sex parents. And we finally got the FOIA request answered and got a document dump, and we found the Witherspoon Institute funding. We found that a consultant for the Witherspoon Institute was actually shaping the research, that they had gone to a university specifically to get a kind of academic frontman for the study, and that it was designed specifically to influence these court cases. And so now I believe the credibility of that study has been blown up. A second tack is political and economic pressure that we can place on these networks. In Media Matters over the years, we've successfully targeted on other issues, on immigration with Lou Dobbs, to get him off CNN, pairing activism and civil rights against Glenn Beck to get him off Fox against Dr. Laura. On the LGBT space, we've worked really hard. You saw our friend Pat Buchanan, that bigot had a paid contract with MSNBC until we went after it. He lost his job. And Tony Perkins, we've paired with GLAAD on a campaign to discourage MSNBC from showing this guy, and he's very infrequently now seen. And when he is seen, he's confronted with their record of hate, and that's really all we ask for. So I think the lesson there is we have more power than we know if we can marshal it. And just a couple of closing notes going forward. I think that our movement should recognize that media needs to be the second issue for all of us. It's the way the issue that we care about is being refracted through the media. It's how people are making their impressions and forming their public policy conclusions and how they're voting. We see organizations as a form of media and should be considered that way. For example, we monitor blog posts of these organizations, we monitor podcasts, again, to cast a very wide net and to be able to shine that light. Our organizations could probably do a better job in partnering with other organizations in other spheres that are being targeted by this misinformation and propaganda. And by that I mean we have the same cast of villains. The people out there talking about women's rights and calling people sluts and all the hate-filled rhetoric on immigration. It's the same cast of characters, and we could build those bonds. Typically, our own groups have been a little skittish, I think, about taking on the media in an aggressive way. Understandably, organizations want to get good press coverage and have good relations with the press, but our experience has been they'll respect you if you're aggressive, if you stand up and push back. Lastly, I think the last day and a half has shown, we need more compelling spokespeople out in the media, whether they're non-white, whether they're religious. We have a media training program that we do in Media Matters. The right wing spends about $12 million a year to train their folks and get them out on television. We've started this initiative where we train talkers and then we book them. We've done some LGBT specific trainings that have worked quite well. There's a huge demand for this, and I think we could do more of it. And then finally, the importance of Spanish language media. We largely don't know what's being said in this media. Hispanic Americans, about 50%, consume Spanish language media, and so we're proposing going forward to set up a monitoring operation of that to find out what kind of bigoted, Rush Limbaugh types are out there polluting the environment in critical places like Florida. So I believe we can win these information wars if we're vigilant. And if we stand up for ourselves, because if we don't, nobody else is going to. Thanks.
It's a great segue, because next we're going to have Monica Trasandes. Monica is the director of Spanish language media at GLAAD. The big story in media, in corporate media these days, is contraction. Fewer outlets, fewer reporters, smaller audiences. But that's not true in Spanish language media. It's actually growing significantly. And Monica is going to share with us the significance of that and what's at stake if we don't keep up.
Hola, hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. First, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my family. I came here in 1972. I was 6 years old with my sister from Uruguay. And like a lot of immigrants, we learned the language together, we learned the culture together. We were all we had, and we were a tight little unit. I was worried when I came out to them that they would reject me. And when I did, however, at the age of 22, I found that they did not reject me. They were very supportive. And in fact, to this day, they're very supportive. They're among the best monitors. David, you could probably hire them. They watch every time they see something, they call me, Monica, turn on Telemundo, there's something gay. I'm driving, I can't. They're great. And I thought for a long time I was the only one who had supportive parents, the only Latina, right? And when I would talk to my other Latino friends, they would say the same thing. They would say, well, I'm really lucky, but everybody else has terrible experiences. Well, it turns out that's not true. The reality is that Latinos are very supportive. Latino support is growing, I should say. We're not there by a long shot. But actually in 2010, it was the Gill Foundation and Movement Advancement Project that helped us create some research, which was incredibly important in terms of starting to change the narrative and tell the story of how Latinos really feel about LGBT people and issues. Among those findings was 83% of Latinos support discrimination protections. This was a far-ranging study that went into 5 different states. We did telephone surveys, online surveys, focus groups. It was Latinos who are Mexican American, who are Cuban, all from different demographics. And we found really strong support. Since then, we've seen a lot of studies, including this one, which is actually a 2012 study from National Council of La Raza that showed 54% of support among Latinos for same-sex marriage. And I know you already heard some of those statistics, but the Pew has done studies, NBC Latino, Wall Street Journal. Fortunately, the news is getting out there that Latinos are supportive. So it's really important to be involved in media because, as you all know, media is where we change hearts and minds. Media is where that little abuelita who doesn't know anybody gay or doesn't think she knows or knows somebody but they haven't come out yet, where she meets an LGBT person in Spanish language media, right? And Spanish language media is incredibly important because of the language connection, because of the fact that Latinos there are represented in a way they're not in English language media by a long shot. So there are these cultural connections that are really important. And it's growing. Spanish language media, unlike English language media, sadly, is growing quickly. And it's doing well. Univision often now beats the competition in many markets, the English language competition. It's the third instead of NBC or ABC. It's the third one in terms of ratings. So we need to be there, which is what we do. It's what I do at GLAAD, right? And we need to be there more, though. We need to be much more present. So let me give you a little snapshot of how they're doing, how Spanish language media is doing. They're doing better. There's a lot more to go, but they're doing better. We're seeing much more representation. We're seeing more segments in the news and in scripted, less in scripted, but more. And the news media is doing a much, much better job just in the last 5 years since I've been at GLAAD. So coming out stories. This is Orlando Cruz from Puerto Rico. He came out last year. He's a boxer. It's fantastic. And the way he came out was great. He came out proudly, did an interview. He was, I'm out, I'm proud. His mom was interviewed on Telemundo. But the way it was handled by Telemundo and others as well was very different framing. It was joyous. It was, here's a man who's coming out. Look, he's coming out. It wasn't, oh my God, he's coming out. He's the only one. No, that's starting to change quickly. Also in terms of issues covering people like transgender people, like Ariana, who's a fantastic spokesperson. We trained her, so I'm a little more proud of her. But she went through the GLAAD POC Media Institute, and she's fantastic about telling her story as a trans woman from Peru originally. And that's also being handled less as a controversial issue and much better, deeper framing, right? More people are coming out in terms of their support as allies. That's the cast of Levántate, which was a morning show on Telemundo. And they're all wearing purple because it's Spirit Day, right? And so we've seen them. We've seen lots of celebrities come out and support us. Just this week, the lead singer of Maná performed for the president, his inaugural, came out with a beautiful Facebook statement about marriage equality. He and his wife are supporters. So people are starting to come out, a lot as allies. Now, novellas are incredibly important because they're on every night. They're scripted nighttime soaps. They're on every night for months. So when you watch these, you get really invested in the characters, right? And you care. And so novelas, fortunately, have been doing better, although it's an up and down thing with novelas because, for example, this year we didn't nominate any novelas because none, in all the novelas, in a lot of them there were gay characters, but they were back in the background again. Whereas 2 years ago, they were lead characters, right? It's tough to get to the writers, though, and the producers of novelas because they're in Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina. They are not, they're starting to produce more in the US, but for the most part, they're international. So we need to find a way to get to them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to help media, really more journalists do their jobs and continue and do even better because there's a lot we can do. And part of that is to nurture the insiders, the progressives who are in media. Media folks are progressive by nature, and if they're not, their jobs usually educate them. But a lot of people will tell me, they'll say, Monica, I'm progressive, my sister's gay, my father's gay, my uncle, but hey, my audience is not. So a huge part of my job has been to say, no, your audience is actually, look at this study, look at this study, look at that study, to convince them that their audience is not so different from them. And then to help them share that. So a lot of what we do at GLAAD, what I do is, we translate and we prepare studies, poll statistics, and make it media friendly so that they can quickly throw up a slide when they're doing an interview, so that they can, share that with people and say, you're not the only one. And then arm them with spokespeople who are trained in Spanish, who are comfortable with a camera, who can tell a great story. We all know the incredible importance of telling personal stories. So that's really important. And we package it, to teach other activists, too, other advocates around the country who could be working with Spanish language media, how to package those stories, how to talk to the reporters and the editors and the decision makers so that they say, oh, you're right, this is a no-brainer. It all starts with a great narrative. So you start with that. This is a great story. It's powerful. It touches on the things that move people, which, as we heard earlier, family, love and commitment. Respect for others is a huge issue among Latinos, a huge theme, a value among Latinos. And that's something we heard when we did the research a lot. Why do you feel so supportive? When we pushed back and said, why are you supportive? They said, because respect for others. That's incredibly important, as well as family support. And, of course, an understanding of discrimination, unfortunately, and an understanding of what that feels like. So an example of how it can come together beautifully was last year when the president came out in support of marriage. We were ready with things in Spanish for media, with studies for them to use and show on screen, and with spokespeople who were ready with op-eds in Spanish and so forth. And what happened was that we got much better framing. It wasn't framed as a controversial decision. It was framed as, oh, the president came out, this community is incredibly joyful. Let's talk to some members of the LGBT community. Wow, what a historic moment. And then include the opposition. I mean, they haven't stopped interviewing, the opposition. But it's not framed that way anymore. It's not such a simple framing. It's far better. So we have a lot more to do, though. There are huge challenges. Violence is growing in Mexico City. In Honduras, we saw 70 people killed between 2008 and 2012. So there's still so much violence in Latin America and here too, obviously. The rise of the evangelical movement is a big concern. In Brazil, it's growing so quickly. In other countries in Latin America, in this country, the evangelical movement has been very smart about getting out front on immigration and redefining themselves. And, it's a little frightening how strong they're getting. That photo is from Puerto Rico. It was only a few months ago. They got 200,000 people out to a march for family values. And of course, the lack of Spanish language competence nationally and in states. We need more people who can do the kind of work that I'm doing with Spanish language media. But we have momentum. We're starting from a good place. Latinos are supportive. Spanish language media is interested. We just have to do more, and we can, and we will. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, our final speaker is going to be Thomas Wheatley. Thomas is the Director of Organizing at Freedom to Marry. But Thomas is going to share from his experience in the States on issues from non-discrimination to marriage, how the lines between communications and organizing are really beginning to blur, and what that means, particularly in the States, in terms of staffing and training.
So I am going to get down into the weeds a little bit, but before I do that, I want to just get something out of the way. They did let a field organizing guy on this panel. It's a communications panel, but I'm still a field organizer. Just keep it as a secret so Bobby doesn't get in trouble. I got my start in this work organizing street protests in New York City. That's me in the corner. The sideburns are a little unfortunate, but that's me with a lot less gray hair. And I'm still a member of the Field Organizers Trade Union, the International Association of Truth Tellers, Boat Rockers, and Troublemakers. We have our own code of ethics. If you can't count it, it didn't actually happen. Before I joined Freedom to Marry, I worked at Basic Rights Oregon for 7 years. It was 2005 when I joined that team. And I started in the wake of a really devastating loss at the ballot when marriage when the DOMA was passed into the Constitution there. And my job after that, in the wake of that loss, was to build a statewide network of field organizers who would go out and train and recruit volunteers to take action for domestic partnerships, non-discrimination, and safe schools. At the time, and I want to kind of get into what does it really look like to do this work at a state organization. So at the time, Basic Rights Oregon was a big organization by, as we measure state organizations. It was a staff of 5 plus several field organizers. And I really thought at that time that having that one communications person was really a luxury. And so when the organization decided at the kind of next stage of the game to kind of tighten up the organizing team and add somebody who was really focused in on the digital world, on online communication and online organizing, the field organizer in me just scoffed. You know, what is a weblog anyway? You're going to put videos on Who's Tube and people will actually watch them. You know, I thought that, you know, that this digital staffer was taking the place of what I considered real people doing real work that would make real change. So I don't like to admit it often, but clearly I was dead wrong. As Tara outlined for us, we live in a brave new world and a complicated one in terms of the kind of media channels, with the kind of downfall of newspapers, the rise of a more diffused communications network, and the more interactive media. Now our organizations, like David was saying, our organizations are our own media creators as well, through bloggers and Twitters and so forth. And you know, even me, now I get most of my news via Facebook and can watch a video on my phone. So it's important that we adjust to this world, but it is confusing, it's fuzzy. How do you as a state organization figure out how to build your audience? What's your Twitter strategy? And how does that differ from your approach to Instagram? And like, what is Instagram anyway? And can one staffer, that one person, do that all themselves, or do they need a whole team? And in an environment, though, where Twitter or Facebook can be used to mobilize 1,000 people or 2,000 people to a rally on 72 hours notice, as happened in this event a year ago after a hate crime in Portland, Oregon, well, we ought to figure out how to boost our capacity and our expertise in this area. So I still haven't given up the field organizer code of ethics, still a member of the union, and I still do believe that a face-to-face conversation is tremendously powerful in comparison to a request to change your profile picture. And the data is clear, right, that you could email somebody till you're blue in the face, but you will never convince them via email to cast their ballot. But if you knock on 100 doors, you will talk to 28 people, and you will get 2 votes at the ballot. The data is crystal clear on the research on that. That said, I guess I'm evolving my opinion, but now believing that we can't nourish statewide political organization and education campaigns on a strict diet of shoe leather and door knocking alone. So how does this landscape kind of change the day-to-day of state organizations? So think about a communications staffer who is typically that one person in an organization, and their job was to focus on press releases, on editorial boards, on op-eds, and they maintained the email list a little bit, and they focused on, probably had a volunteer back in the day doing the website. Now that person has to really focus also, in addition to that, on building and cultivating a digital audience, on reach on email, on Facebook, on Twitter. They are a Jack or Jane of all trades. And so think about that average 35-year-old communications director who can rock a press release or completely wow an editorial board. How do they learn to write a digital communications strategy? Or what about a field director who came up in the shoe leather era of organizing and now has to hire a digital online organizer? So how do they do an interview where they separate the kind of code jockey who understands all the digital world but can't actually speak human to human versus an activist who's bubbly but doesn't know how to sort an Excel spreadsheet and actually spot the digital operative that they're trying to hire? You know, back in the good old days, which is 5, 6, 7 years ago, I used to teach field organizers that they couldn't count a commitment that they received for an event, like a lobby day. They couldn't count it as a commitment if they received that commitment via email. That didn't count toward their daily goals. They had to look that person in the eye, or they had to speak to them directly over the phone in order to be able to count that toward their daily goals. And now field organizers can friend their volunteers on Facebook and recruit through their personal networks. It's not the same, but nor can we ignore it. So do we teach the old dogs new tricks, how to digitize their strategies? Or do we teach the young guns how to write a strategic plan, optimize their program, set measurable goals, and bring a program to scale? So this question, to me, really speaks to how we structure our state organizations, because we're blurring the lines. We're blurring the lines between what is organizing on the ground and what is communications in the digital world. Is it field organizing or communications if our job is to drive up the likes and the share rate on a Facebook post that's designed to get people to attend lobby day, where we're basically gaming the system of the Facebook algorithm? We tried an experiment like this at Basic Rights Oregon several years ago, where we hired 2 full-time young activists to do this work, applying shoe leather techniques to the digital world, e-communicating with people one by one and getting them to share our content out to their personal networks and audiences. It had a short-term impact, although admittedly I don't think we figured out how to give it legs in the long run. It left me wondering, how do you do this translation? How do you take online discussion and turn that into offline action? Can you get a Facebook follower to show up to a lobby day? Can you get a Tweeter follower to call their legislator or to cast their ballot a certain way? And if so, should we change the balance of staffing at our organizations and the incipient campaign so that there's a more balanced approach to the field organizing team, which traditionally has been a large team in these organizations when we have the capacity, and then shift it to a more equal balance? Or could there be a day someday when the mode of communication, whether that's Facebook conversation or a phone call, whether that's a Twitter message or an in-person presentation in a church basement, where that mode of communication is, sorry, going back here, where the mode of communication is interchangeable. So let's really be clear, though. All of this is in theory. In truth, our state organizations have very little capacity to do this work. Take a state campaign in a place like Delaware, Nevada, or Hawaii, all of which are on the cusp of moving marriage forward. But in January of this year, we had not a single full-time staff person at a state equality organization in any of these 3 states. They can't afford to hire a digital staffer. They can't even afford to hire an executive director. So to make up for some of this, we have to figure out workarounds. So for example, in 2 of these states, in Hawaii and Delaware, my colleagues at Freedom to Marry on our digital team are from New York running online communications for these states. It's an interesting model. It's a shared capacity that we as a movement invest in nationally and deploy to states on an as-need basis. So let's think, though, about those states that might have the capacity to hire their own digital staff. Where do they find training? Well, it's a complicated web of networks and organizations that you would typically look to. And I can say from personal experience working in a state organization, it's really hard to figure out, who do you go to? Do you go to the folks in your state at the progressive table? Are they the smart ones on this? Do you go to your national partners? Are there regional intermediaries? It's a complicated web and difficult to navigate. You know, there is one success story on this front that's interesting to lift up. You know, a few years ago, Gill Foundation and others sponsored a LGBT digital organizer week-long boot camp, where digital organizers from around the country, from state and national organizations, were trained in these new techniques by an expert in the field, the New Organizing Institute. Here you had a digital specialist training both state and national leaders and being able to deploy that in the long run. This kind of approach, you know, might be able to work in states like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Virginia, which in a lot of ways represent the kind of next frontier of our state-based policy work. All of these states voted for Obama in 2012, and none of them has a comprehensive non-discrimination or a comprehensive domestic partnership or civil union law. So if we're going to tackle non-discrimination in marriage in these states in the next 3, 5, even 7 years, we're going to need digital expertise and capacity and year-round field organizing on the ground. And we want to figure out how we move the work in these states at a faster pace than we've moved the work in previous states. So my experience in Oregon comes to bear here. So the non-discrimination law in Oregon was introduced every legislative session from 1973 until 2007. That's 34 years of work, day after day, year after year, to get this law passed. Obviously, we don't want to be on the 4-year plan in Virginia or Pennsylvania, nor should we be. The challenge, though, is that the next round of states are not traditional bastions of liberal social policy, and that they don't have significant infrastructure. The state-based equality organizations in these 5 states have an average of 4 staff members on their team. 2 of them have a single staff member focused on communications. And I'm willing to bet that that staff member has a variety of duties outside of the communication sphere as well. Right? So there's just not a lot of there that would, to do the work. So do we need to build organizations as large as our strongest state organizations like Basic Rights Oregon, which has 23 staff now, or One Colorado, which has 11, or Empire State Pride Agenda, which has 16? Maybe, maybe not. Do we need to build these kinds of organizations in all 50 states? Definitely not, right? The roadmap to victory shows clearly on an issue like marriage that we can win marriage in enough states, build up the kind of broad base of public opinion, and then turn to a national actor to be able to provide a federal solution through the courts or Congress. But we do need to accelerate the pace of change. And I think that means breaking down some of these artificial barriers between traditional and new communications, traditional media and digital communications, between communications and field organizing as we digitize our lives every day, and between state and national organizations. It means being creative about how we train the leaders at the local level to work across the boundaries in this new environment, whether they are doing communications or field or both. And it means being more nimble and flexible in our approach and how we build our organizations. And so every day I work with state organizations, and from my vantage point, I don't think we have this formula quite figured out. There's still work to do. But I do think that we are definitely moving forward. So thank you.